his many wares there, and we are very pleased to partner with our colleagues at the College of Medicine, Dr. Jeffrey Joyce and Dr. Sylvie Nair, to bring this lecture to you today. And with that, let's give Ken, Dr. Resnikow, a warm Tallahassee welcome.
Thank you. I'm going home tonight. It will be 33 degrees, so you could have climate superiority all day if you'd like. Thank you, Ellen and Sylvie, the CTSA program, School of Social Work. The only difficult thing about coming here was choosing what to speak about. So I thought about talking about our MI work, but you have Sylvie here, so no need to do that. And I thought about talking about our health disparities work. But I ended up, we're going to talk about our e-health work. But there's a drop of MI in it and a drop of disparities in it. But let's begin. So what I want to do is talk about two aspects of e-health, m-health, digital health. They're all about the same. I'm going to spend the first part of the talk telling you some advances in the message content. How do we use these platforms to deliver what a good MI counselor would say? How do we use these platforms to use theory-based interventions? And the part that most of you will find sexier and will keep you awake is the tech part. So I'm going to share with you some really cool tech features that we're doing and other people are doing, like geolocation. And I'll share with you an app that we are launching this week where every single fast food restaurant has been marked on our app, and anytime an adolescent walks into the fast food restaurant and our app is open, it says, hey, you just entered McDonald's. You mentioned you might have a salad next time. How about it? So I'll show you how we're doing that and all the various cool things you can do with the little mega computers that we call phones. So let me tell you first a little bit about tailoring. So tailoring has been around for a long time. It's our version of precision medicine. It's what behavioral scientists do to make individualized interventions. So we've been writing about it for 20 years. And basically, tailoring incorporates three strategies: personalization, feedback, and content matching. Personalization has been around for almost 50 years. It still occurs. When you get a little envelope in the mail that says, hello, Susie, and that's all they know about you, that's personalization. There's really good data that increases the odds that you will open an envelope. It also increases the credibility of the message. We're not going to talk too much about personalization, other than to say it's one of the more rudimentary tailoring strategies. Here's another one. The next core strategy is feedback. And as simple as it may sound, there are actually many types of feedback digital health products can use. So there's descriptive feedback. Simply, when Fitbit counts the number of steps you've taken, or an app measures your pulse by putting the finger on the camera, that's descriptive feedback. But it doesn't interpret it. It has no denominator. So there's three types of feedback you can use that have a denominator. The first is comparative other normative. So compared to other people who are at your university, here's how many steps you're getting, or compared to other people in your department. It instantly grabs your attention because you're both curious and ashamed at the same time, but it makes you want to listen to that message more. The next is injunctive norms. And those are simply norms you say, here's where you should be. Well, you should be at 5 servings of fruit and vegetables, 10,000 steps. You're at 3 servings of fruit and vegetable and 4,000 steps. That also grabs your attention, although, as we'll talk about, we discourage those types of messages because they often are perceived as controlling. And that's going to be one of the themes of our talk, is that if we're not careful, our apps can actually discourage people. The average length of time people keep on a Fitbit or similar device is about 2 weeks. And the reason they take them off is they are discouraged by the messages they were receiving. It's not because there's a rash on their wrist from the band. It's no longer loving me. And the most powerful form of feedback that takes actually some pretty high-tech programming is ipsative feedback. Ipsative feedback is comparing you to yourself. So we might say, we have about, 30 apps that use this. Here's how many steps you had over the last month. Here's your A1C levels for diabetics in the last month. Here's your drug refills over the last year. Here's your weight. People seem to pay attention to that more than any other type of feedback. So anytime you could use ipsative feedback, yourself compared to yourself, perhaps sprinkled with normative and injunctive, you have a really good chance of holding their attention. Let me show you an example. I actually got to consult with Fitbit for a couple of years. I went on a speaking tour with them and started to work with them about how to handle feedback on bad days. So this is descriptive feedback you could get from a activity tracker. Here's comparative feedback, comparative injunctive, in fact. You're supposed to get 10,000 steps, you're getting 2,000. Or you're supposed to get 10,000, you're getting 12,000. Here's what normative feedback would look like. 2,000, should be getting 3. Okay? This is what your peers are doing. Then collective, a lot of people use teams and say, well, your team has only 100,000, whereas the other team has 140,000, as opposed to your team has 140, everyone else has 100. And finally, here's ipsative. The reason I'm bringing these up is we actually have to message these very differently. If you look here, okay, here, 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 and here, it's a positive metric. The feedback is encouraging. You're doing better than expected. That one is very easy to message. So that's the little smiley face. The question is, how in a digital device should you message the bad days? Right now, if you look at almost all the devices, they're very unsophisticated. Here's the types of things they say. These are the typical messages across the various products in the market when you're not reaching your goal. How empathetic, for those of you who know MI, how empathetic, how much does this roll with resistance? How much does this make the person comforted? As opposed to this is controlling and discouraging. Well, this is why people take their devices off after 2 weeks. So I'm going to share with you the types of messages that we use on bad days. See if you recognize them. So how do you feel when you read these messages? Do you feel more like we have, in fact, comforted the afflicted, as opposed to afflicted the comfortable? So I want to spend a fair bit of time giving you a little background of how do we get to this, and how do we continue to use this approach as opposed to just get over it, just walk more. Well, to do that, I have to talk about the third type of tailoring, which is message adaptation or content matching. So this is what it is. We get data from the user. Historically, it's been by questionnaire. Increasingly, we collect it from other sources like their electronic health record, maybe from their smartphone location, maybe from their social media, or maybe from their purchasing behavior. And we take that data and we generally have to classify it usually in up to 3 categories, low, medium, and high, but typically it's just low and high. So we take your data and we put you into usually 2 categories. Then we write logic and say, well, if you score 1 on that variable, we'll pull message 1. If you score 2 on that variable, we'll pull message 2. So obviously that means you need a massive message library. So you need messages for high and low, sometimes high, low, and medium, for in our cases, hundreds and hundreds of variables. And your tailoring engine, and we have software called MTS, the Michigan Tailoring System, does this work. It takes your classification and it pulls the right message for you and presents it in an attractive way. That's eHealth 101. What I want to share with you is I think we're at a pretty big crossroads. The vast majority of eHealth products continue to use the 3 Fs. They continue to F people, as we say. Fear, facts, and feedback. Those are actually really poor strategies. What is interesting, if you look at the behavioral models that were around in the 80s and 90s, you could reduce them to one common element. They basically are telling you, tell people it's worse than you think. Now you can call that outcome expectancies, you can call that perceived severity and susceptibility, you can call it norms, but basically the essence of health education for 25 years was, it's worse than you think, you should do something about it, you're going to kill yourself. These are the types of messages you get from these models. What I want to share with you today is what we call the second generation of messaging. And instead, we're going to use these models. I'm going to focus a little bit on just 2, SDT and MI today. But we are now going to message based upon what is the meaning of the behavior? How do you handle resistance? What personality traits can we tailor on? So let me show you a classic first generation tailored website. So I don't know how big the font is back there, so I'll walk you through. It says, with one being the most important reason, why do you want to quit smoking? Okay, so this person, the most important reason was personal health, and then gaining control, and then financial concerns and pressure. Then it asked, what are your health limitations here? And they don't really have much. And what are your other health conditions? So a traditional tailored first generation product would say this. It does a little bit of reflective tailoring, but fundamentally it falls apart here. And it ends up with, it's worse than you think, you're going to kill yourself. And we know, just like you are experiencing right now, that is motivating for a tiny fraction of the US population. That is not a salient message. So here's a second generation website. It's a little complicated to present, but you'll have to follow along. Whoops, sorry. So here, we're tailoring on this orange principle, or this orange construct of confidence. So we're feeding back their confidence. We're also tailored on their motivations. And we're also tailoring on their physical activity behavior. Further, we start to tailor on their type or quality of motivation, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. So here we're giving feedback that your motivation is towards the intrinsic or autonomous level, which we give positive feedback for. And then we help them reflect back on their motivation and try to build more autonomous motivation and roll with resistance. Now, I'm going to share with you what we call our tailoring table. So this is just taking one variable out of our tailoring system for a highly tailored intervention we're doing with colleagues at Vanderbilt. So this is an intervention for African American men who are at risk of diabetes, who are not eating well, and who are overweight. But the tailoring variable here is whether or not they feel role strain as a Black male. Take a look at the two different messages for high and low on role strain. This is held constant, okay, for this presentation. So take a look at this message. So this is the message that will appear on their computer screens and their phones. See if you see the subtle distinction between the high role strain and low strain message. Very subtle. But when we pre-test these messages, men who have high strain will say, you know, I like that first message better. So if you do A/B testing, they don't know which is which, and we say which one fits you. Generally, we are able to write the right message, which we test with A/B testing, and say, this is the one that is for low strain, this is for high strain. Let me show you another one. This is for something Sylvie actually got us connect with it indirectly, a young faculty member who is working with HIV positive LGBT youth in Detroit who smoke. Okay, let's take a look at the message for high stigma and high Black identity, and let's compare that to this one. Do you see any difference here? So the difference is sexual discrimination here, right? Do you see any difference in the message? I hope you do. All right. If identity is low, stigma is low, we really don't talk about those identities. Now you may say there's going to be no effect of this intervention if they only see message A and B. This is one message out of thousands. So we're talking about over a period of weeks, hundreds and hundreds of individual exposures, they're getting these tailored messages. And we're pretty sure now, looking at this over and over again, that they're much more likely to respond to these interventions the deeper you tailor them. So now let's talk about how do we tailor on a personality characteristic. It's not typically what health education does, but it's really not that hard. So I'm going to use our favorite personality characteristic, which is your preference for directive or autonomy supportive messages. Do you like Fox News or do you like NPR? And that tells us a lot about you. If you're in the Fox News type, you strongly agree with this item. And we're going to code people 6 and above for today, and 5 and below is going to be the NPR people. Autonomy, low autonomy, in other words, motivational interviewing and directive health education. So when we give our writers what we call a writer's notebook, we say, this is the language you should write in the high autonomy condition. Remember, that's on the low end of the scale because they have to disagree with this. And this is the language you're going to use in the low autonomy condition. Do you see the differences? There's at least 3 fundamental differences in the push and pull. A, the push is more directive and definitive. B, if you look at the pull messages, they pose more questions, they're more tentative, they underpromise, whereas these overpromise. So it turns out this is a very powerful trait to tailor on. We've now completed multiple RCTs, where if I just know that one question item from you, I can predict how you're going to respond. I won't have time to go into too much detail today, but we know that people who agree with this item do not do very well with motivational interviewing. People who agree with this item do very well with motivational interviewing. So I'm going to show you what the message library looks like for a physical activity program that we tailored on. So let's look at the push message first. Not bad. It's not supposed to be offensive. We're not trying to be assholes. But notice the difference between that and the pull version. It's subtle. Poses questions, it doesn't have the answer for you, and asks the person to do more psychological work. Let's look at the pull version of this. Again, questions and tentative. Here's 2 more, pick one to look at. Here's a smoking cessation push-pull library. So here's the pull, here's the push. Here's the push, here's the pull. So we have created, for about 10 health behaviors, a push-pull library of messages that we would tailor just on that one item of tell me what to do. And it continues to work, that matching on this one characteristic. Now there's hundreds of personality characteristics. This is just one that if you tailor on will increase attention to your messages and outcomes. So now let me introduce you to something we've already shown you, but we didn't name it. So we're going to talk about reflective tailoring, but I'm going to show you in a pretty sophisticated way. So here I have to throw in a little bit of motivational interviewing. If you don't know anything about motivational interviewing, one thing you can know is the major thing that differs from other counseling styles is we respond primarily with reflection. So if you tell me how sad you are, rather than giving you advice or ask a question, I will reflect, you seem really sad about that. Now it's complicated. We have 9 types of reflections. There's different levels, simple, complex, and all this stuff. But basically, this is what you have to know about a reflection. It's a statement. If you're verbalizing and it goes down, that means nothing in the written messages. There's no down tone in written messages. It's not a question, but most importantly, it's your best guess for what did you just say, why did you say it, and where you're going with it. So it turns out digital health communications can do very advanced reflections. So I'm going to show you how we do it. So this is how a counselor constructs their reflections. This is what we call the long form, and this is the short form. Basically, the short form is simply cutting off, it sounds like, so you're saying, I think, and jumping right to you. So that's how a counselor does it. Turns out digital health can do it pretty well. So I want you to get into the weeds with me. Here's a baseline questionnaire. I'm just going to use this one because it's a nice example. This is someone who's on a diabetes medication, okay? They've missed 3 doses in the last week. This is a survey they filled out on their phone, okay? Think for a second, if you were their MI counselor, what would be the next thing you would say? Well, this is what our app would say to them. Now it's wordy. This is actually 2 screens worth. But I hope you can see how every single item is incorporated into this feedback story. So this is an app sounding like an MI counselor. This is not how the first generation of apps talk to people. I hope if you are an app person, this will look very alien to you. Let's do one more. I'm going to move ahead because of time. So here's one for substance use. Ellen mentioned there's some folks in the room who might be interested. So here's one for substance use. Just 6 item. Now keep in mind, because they're answering a 2, we're not going to tailor too much on this, okay? We're not going to say they feel pressure. So start to think about what would an MI counselor say? Well, we hope our app is just as good as that. So here's individual chunks. Now, in the previous one I showed you when they're all stitched together, the quilt was all put together. These are the individual patches which the app ties together and makes it look like a single narrative.
So I'm interested, how do you define what you think are chunks of information an individual can take on? That doesn't seem to be related to the other measures.
So we do have things like literacy and other things that will titrate the amount of text. Yeah. And there's various controls that we can do. I'm not going to show you today, but there people can push on it and get more information. So they can get the top line, and then there's a buried level below it if they want to see. You want to see more? Push. Something we call those window shades. But I hope you can see we're honoring the principles of reflection. We are not just reflecting exactly what they said. That's actually what MI does not encourage. We don't like verbatim parroting, simple paraphrasing. We like to guess what's behind this, what's the meaning here. We're taking risks here, and we could be wrong, just like with MI. I'm going to skip this one because of time, other than to say we have hundreds of these inferential tailoring statements. So now I want to talk about something that many of you are aware of, which is self-determination theory. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of SDT. Okay, about right, about half. So SDT is fantastic. It's changed our practice of MI, and I think it's the best explanation for why MI works. But it also tells you how to do your counseling and how to do your digital health products. I'm just going to give you 2 insights from SDT, and I'm going to show you how you can tailor on them. So SDT has told us there's 3 human needs: autonomy, competence, relatedness. Across 35 countries, 3,000 manuscripts. In every culture they've looked at it, when these needs are met, good things happen. The original research was org psych, school site performance and work site performance. It predicted who's doing well in school, who's happy at their job. But in the last 10 years or so, there's been a tremendous interest in saying, well, don't these 3 things predict health? Very much they do, particularly these 2. So we very much are going to tailor on autonomy and competence. The second observation of SDT is, it is not the quantity of motivation, it is the quality. And that's a very important observation. There are 2 types fundamentally of motivation. There's actually others. If you're a real SDT person, you understand there's a whole continuum, but these are the 2 primary divisions that we deal with. Which is the one that feels more MI, autonomous or controlled? Hopefully you'll see it's autonomous. What we say is, you could be really high on shame and guilt. You can score a 10. You can score on a scale of 100. I am 100 on my guilt and shame. What SDT has told us, that person's motivational quality is poor. Their motivational quality is not ready for change, even though the quantity is high. So when we combine those 2 slides, we get this very nice decision tree. Do not start behavior change messaging until all 3 of these things are true. They must have met the criteria for high quality motivation: autonomy, meaning, and efficacy. Our apps have a why section, almost all of them. Before we go to how would be throw away your ashtrays, tell your friends that you're going to quit, go buy your birth control, whatever it is. Before you do any action steps, we want to build these 3 pillars of motivational quality. However, what it also teaches us that if you have a person who's still scoring high on these, they are not ready for how. You are prematurely jumping them into the action phase. Their success rate is going to be poor. So we call this tar sands motivation. You guys know what tar sands fuel is that they're going to pipe down all the way from northern Canada, North Alaska? It's really low quality fuel. It's almost not worth it. And if you don't purify it, you get no energy out of it. So that's why we consider this tar sands motivation. So what we're going to try and do with our apps now for a few minutes is build high quality motivation. We're going to, instead of just trying to do the big 3 F's, we're going to use these principles of roles, values, and meaning, which is a synonym for autonomous or integrated motivation. So clinically, we love these 0 to 10 questions. Almost every MI counselor knows the Rolnick paper from 1992, whatever, and you ask the 2 questions, importance, confidence, and then you probe why not higher, why not lower, and what would it take to get to a higher number. Well, it turns out when people give you their numbers, it allows you to put them into 4 quadrants, which eHealth loves. They come already codified. They already come into classifications. So we're particularly interested right now in these 2 diagonals. This is a high-high and a low-low. This is a mixed, okay? Well, our writer's notebook has standard language for every quadrant. So for this person who's a can't but wants to, which in terms of the 0 to 10 pattern is as follows. Their importance is an 8, 9, or a 10, but their efficacy is a 1 or a 2. That's a can't, want to. This is the fundamental message structure that we start with. Well, let's look at the other quadrant. Can, but doesn't want to. High efficacy, low importance. Yeah, I could quit my last 2 cigarettes that I'm down to, but why bother? I can, I don't want to. This is the fundamental message structure for our e-health programs. Now, let's get into it a little deeper. We know the 2 most powerful ways to motivate people and to build efficacy are to try and link the behavior change to what they value and what their strengths are. We tend to have an algorithm in our apps that goes as follows. If the importance question is lower than the confidence question, they do a values activity. And if their strengths are lower than their values, we do a strengths activity. Sorry, if their confidence is lower than their importance, we do a strengths activity. So they pick out a list, usually 3 or 4. And here's what it looks like on one of the apps I developed for Aetna Insurance. So I spent the last 10 years building their digital health products. So this is what the Active Health app looks like. What values are important to you? And this is the feedback that the app gives them if they chose those 2 values. Because of time, I'm going to skip this, but if those of you really know self-determination theory, this questionnaire puts you into autonomous and controlled motivation scores. And if someone was high on controlled motivation, which are the white items, guilt and shame, we have a system to tailor on that. And just very briefly, we say, you're motivated, but we're basically telling them the quality of your motivation sucks, but we don't use that language. We say, that's great that you come here with a lot of shame and guilt. However, and motivational interviewing says this is called raising concern, we have found you'll probably do better if you can find some deeper meaning to this other than shame and guilt. And the next part of the app puts them back into the values activity, and hopefully we've now rebalanced their quality of motivation. So because of time, I'm going to skip that. If you're interested, this is now 2 variables tailored at the same time. This is the pull version of it, and this is the push version of it. It's very subtly different. For the people who said, don't tell me what to do, we leave the messages largely blank. For the people who say, tell me what to do, the values messages are all spoon-fed for them. If you guys know about central processing, part of the Fox News character doesn't want to do a lot of central processing if you're a health comm person. Just to show you what the strengths look like, this is the strengths list. Remember, if confidence is low, they do this. And this is the initial message structure for people based upon what strengths they chose. So this is a way digitally to do MI based on SDT, moves away from pure facts and feedback. All right, I'm done with the content part. I still got 20 minutes to do the sexy part. All right, now you can wake up if you think health education is boring. All right, so I'm going to share with you some really cool things going on that largely are based on phones, although tablets have most of the same functions. Less so PCs and laptops. They can do some of this stuff, but obviously they're not mobile. So let me start with geolocation. So we've done 3 now. The first one was what you might think is a pretty bland topic. People with congestive heart failure have to watch their sodium intake. So we created an app, our lab, Low Salt for Life, and you start out by registering, where do you shop in Michigan? And this person shops at Bush's Fresh Market in Pinckney. Now that has been loaded, when they get to that market, the app wakes up and says, oh, you're at Bush's. What are you shopping for? Well, I am shopping for mustard. Well, could you please scan that barcode and we'll tell you how much sodium it is compared to other products. And we have a database that has all the mustards in the world. And the same if they're at Chipotle and that's where they're eating. Say, well, here's the food you're eating, but you could also have these. So we've downloaded all these brands that are in the supermarket and fast food, and it gives what we call just-in-time Invivo feedback and advice while they're in the marketplace. Now, there's other technology here we're not going to talk about. If you use infrared and other radio frequency broadcasters in a store, you can even get precision down to you're in front of the dairy shelf right now. And last time you said you might want to try the low salt cheese. Can't do that with GPS, it's not that precise, but there's other technology you can use to get down to the 2-foot level precision. So here's one that I'm very proud of. This is one of my wife and myself mentored the same guy, poor Patrick. He's an ED doc. And this is a study with high-risk youth who have come into the Flint, Michigan emergency room at Hurley Hospital with a violent injury, an injury due to violence. They sign up for the app, and then we do a pretty cool thing with them. We ask them to mark everywhere they've been shot, everywhere they carry their gun, and everywhere where they could fight. So now we know this. Every time they get near any of those locations, we have tailored messaging based on self-determination theory that gives them, hopefully, motivation to walk away or to make the right decision. And we're starting to get to the point where we're trying to predict when they might carry their gun with them. That's a little bit harder, although we're working that as well by using other behavioral indicators, like we ask them every morning, are you feeling pissed off today? Do you feel like fucking someone up today? And by knowing that, we can give preemptive messages that are not dependent on the location, because that's too late, but are still jumping in at the right time. So we're testing this. He just got an RO1. Yeah.
Do you get any negative feedback about the geofencing with the people that are
Big.
high autonomy that don't actually want to?
Yeah, so these are all volunteers. So we don't know, when we get to her dissemination world, we might find out that the market doesn't really want this, but we're not having too much trouble recruiting. But there's definitely big brother issues. Okay. So here's the one that we just about to launch. I mentioned this earlier. So Susan is one of my mentees. She's fantastic. And we have built an app that has every single fast food restaurant in America. I was trying to demo it for you. It's not going to work in here. But when you walk into McDonald's anywhere in America or any fast food chain, it gives you some wake-up messages. We even have an app for mom. It says, hey, you're in the McDonald's with Kanisha. Why don't you order a salad? So the app knows where the other person is. Do a lot of in vivo messaging with that. Same issues of control. They also send us a picture of what they ate, and a dietitian codes it, so the next time they go to a fast food restaurant, we tell them, oh, last time you ate a cheeseburger. This geolocation has tremendous implications. One of them I'm just going to jump to is depression. There's some very smart people, a guy at Northwestern, who can predict your mood by whether or not you've left your house or you went to work or the gym. Just having those three pieces of data can predict for a depressed person their mood. Next, Bluetooth. There's literally infinite use of Bluetooth. For between $7 and $12, you could put a Bluetooth transmitter on almost anything. So you can put it on a pill bottle, you can put it on or inside your diabetes glucose, you can put it on blood pressure devices. So we're not taking credit for this. We did not invent this, but it's just something you should know about. You can do some really cool stuff so that your phone can get a message from almost any device that you can measure something medically, any blood measure, any blood pressure measure, any weight measure, and then your app will know about it. These are all on the market already. Blood pressure, blood glucose, and weight are already well penetrated into the market. Another technology that we take advantage of, and it's been around for a long time, is EMA, Ecologic Momentary Assessment. Basically, your app, your phone, wakes up and says, hey, tell us how you're doing with something. Typically, it's been used to ask about behavior. What we're increasingly using it for is to try and get predictors of your risk behavior a few hours before. So the way we're using it is, today, do you feel the world is unfair? We find that to be a very good question. Are you pissed off today? Are you feeling an urge to use drugs today? Do you feel like hurting someone today? So we're working on the right measures to predict these behaviors and how often we have to ask them. Some of them you only have to ask every 14 days. Some of them are very stable, almost traits, and some things vary every 6 hours. Like what foods you want is highly volatile. You might wake up in the morning wanting salty, and in the afternoon you want sweet. Violence, it turns out, is a little bit more stable than that, but there are days of peak, I want to fuck someone up, and therefore we have to measure it relatively frequently. So there's tons of things you can do that get deep into the person's psyche so you can predict reliably what they're going to do later in the day. In 5 minutes, I'll show you how technology can enhance that self-report. The camera has many uses. The most common currently is you can use it to measure someone's pulse, and if you know their pulse, you can infer their stress state, and you can infer some other things. In fact, you can even infer their engagement in the app from their pulse. There's actually some interesting interpretations of pulse and blood pressure patterns so that you actually can tell if they're liking your app just from that. There's colleagues, University of South Carolina, Frank Triber, really good guy. He has shown that he can lower people's blood pressure just by using this finger-based camera. It's basically the same technology when you go to the emergency room and they measure your pulse, there's a light going through your finger. It's using the same technology here. So I want to get into 2 or 3 final things before we have some questions. And this is a very hot area right now. So I work for a company, actually 2 of them, that are both competing to try and make the best product in this area. And basically what they're saying is, forget trying to use messages that you predict work for this type of person, and we do our best to try and use tailoring to say, well, this type of person would like this. In this approach, every single person gets their own intervention. And so what we do is we get data from a combination of sensors. We get things like the stock market prices. And we find when the person gives us their mood rating of the day, we say, well, here's what makes you happy. This is what the data says. You're happy when this happens. And we continue to refine the intervention to continue to find the things that makes them happy. Now, it doesn't have to be happy. It could be what keeps you off of smoking or what keeps you off of drugs. So this is a high form of personalization where we have no a priori intervention. We have intervention types, messages, and components. And the algorithm keeps poking around in there to maximize whatever your outcome is, in this case, happiness. This is where everything will be. This is precision medicine. So you guys are, if you work in a cancer center or if you know anything about what's going on, this is our version of precision medicine. You're getting a unique cocktail. No one's intervention is exactly the same. Now, there's a scientific version of this that we're real excited about and we've gotten heavily into. It's called reinforcement learning. It's been around for a long time and it hasn't traditionally been used for behavior change apps. It's been used in engineering and other fields, but it turns out it works great for us. What it is kind of what I just said, but I'm going to give you a little bit more science behind it. So it's machine learning, and it basically tells the agent, what should I offer next to this person to maximize our outcomes? The reason it's different for health is this. There's fundamentally 2 RL approaches. It's hard to get the head around, but hopefully I'm going to do a decent job explaining it. In the first RL approach, all I care about is maximizing efficacy. So if, in this case, a smoker remains smoke-free, I will continue to give the message that's working. So if this person was on fear versus autonomy, if you continue to succeed, I will continue with fear. So I'm going to individually build your motivation based upon your behavioral status. It's similar to what I just showed you, but here's the twist. If you relapse under fear messages, I'm going to poke around and try, and let me try the other one. I'm now going to rotate you out and give you message B. So that's sort of what I just said, but here's the additional twist. Another use of RL is not to maximize efficacy, it's to minimize cost. So if you're trying to minimize cost, you program your algorithm much differently. So in this case, if I'm trying to save society money and ration out motivational interviewing, because one session of MI is more expensive than a session with an app, generally, particularly if R&D costs are front-loaded. So in this case, all right, the participant is doing well with exercise and they're getting a tailored app. We would test, the RL engine would say, I'm going to now next week, we usually do it every 2 weeks, I'm going to try either continuing with the app or step you down, because that's going to save us a little money. But what will be more, I think, intuitive is the person is doing well, but they need MI. The last week they got a session from Sylvie. RL, which is trying to reduce costs, will say, you know what, let's see what happens if we take away MI. Let's see if your exercise stays high. And it pokes around in there and tries to find the minimum or least expensive sequence of interventions for you. Now, what's really hard, and we're doing one right now, and this is a brutal slide, I won't even try to explain it, but this is our RL algorithm. We're trying to balance both cost and efficacy. That's a nightmare. Very difficult to do both, but you can. You can have it poke around and try and maximize both and say, let's get maximum efficacy and minimal cost. Really, all apps should be doing this, or all health promotion programs that have multiple components or different messages should be using RL to maximize the personalization and minimize cost. I'm surprised it's taken this long to get into health. We credit one woman, we both know her, Susan Murphy, who was at U of M, now at Harvard. She's like the driving force, along with a woman at Penn State named Collins, who's these two women are just superb. If it wasn't for them, I don't know if we'd even be aware of it. All right. Last two things. So the thing I think is most exciting for us is natural language processing. I think you're going to see amazing things come out of NLP. You already know a lot about NLP. If you have a home assistant, if you have Alexa or any of the other derivatives, there's NLP behind it, okay? Because you're giving it free text and it's interpreting free text. I want to show you some cool applications of NLP. So first, what we did was we took 260 MI transcripts and coded every utterance like you normally do with MI and fed it into a machine learning algorithm. We said, that's a reflection. In fact, that's a simple reflection. That's a complex reflection. That's an open-ended question, okay? And we made sure that the MIDI had inter-rater reliability, and we did. That's not surprising. And we then said, use natural language processing, which looks at not just words. A lot of people think it's just synonyms. It's much deeper than that. It's actual syntax. And this is one of the models of NLP. So it analyzes not just the words that people use, but the sequence of the words and the punctuation in effect. And we told it, please try to mimic these codes. So now we're going to take away the codes, feed you some new information. Can you now predict? Well, it turns out, using this thing called deep syntax, we're about 88% accurate. So we now have trained a machine to recognize reflections and questions. Now, I hope you can see if we can continue to build. We just on Saturday got a big grant from our university. It took us years because people didn't quite get it. But after 2 years, they got it. So we got a large grant that will allow us to do this right. The NLP also told us what are the words that you find in effective and ineffective counting. So in addition to coding every utterance, we coded every encounter as high quality or low quality MI. And not surprising, the NLP said, here's the language I hear in bad encounters, and here's the language I hear in good encounters. It's pretty good. That's exactly what we would expect if you know a little bit about MI. The next thing we wanted to do is train our computer to sense empathy. We use the same 276 encounters, but we're no longer coding on the utterance level. We're now coding on the encounter level. So rather than having 8,000 variables, we really have 276 scores. Either you were high or low empathy. That's it. You got one value for each encounter. So we have much less data, so the prediction is going to be a little less precise. So first of all, it asks, what is the language I hear in high empathy encounters? Interesting. Here's the language of low empathy encounters. Another thing it found is talk time. We found that in low empathy encounters, the clinician talked a lot more. In high empathy encounters, the clinician is mostly listening. We knew that, but it's nice to see it verified. So we incorporated into this, because we actually used audio tapes in this particular analysis, both verbal and nonverbal, and we even included what the patient had said. So we even incorporated the words of the patient. What we ended up with is 80% accuracy in dichotomizing low and high empathy encounters. Now, we're a long way from clinically being able to sell this on the market, but this is what it will eventually do. So eventually, we'll be able to give someone, this is fabricated, our app cannot do this yet accurately, we've tried, it still needs some help, but here's your feedback. Remember feedback from like the third slide? So here's your mean reflections per session. Here's your average empathy per session, and here is some feedback, remember that? That hopefully is autonomy supportive, that we would use their MIDI coded automated system to help coach them. So what we're trying to create here is completely automated coaching. So a human being might learn MI from Sylvie, and we would give them our app, and this would continue to coach them. We've already figured out the minor issue is all you have to do is hit the record button that's in our app, and it records the encounter and it converts it voice to text with about 95% accuracy. That's not the hard part. But this is where we want it to be. Now, what's the obvious next step after this? An AI counselor. So this is the first step in actually creating someone who could counsel with this. Last thing we'll talk about, we'll take questions. I have done none of this research, but I am so stoked by it, I have to share it. I call it behavioral inference. It's not even a thing yet, okay? But this is cool shit. Watch this. Instead of asking you, are you drinking right now? Or instead of measuring your blood alcohol level, there are pieces of data from your phone that will tell you your blood alcohol level. Think about that. With tremendous accuracy. So for example, the number of times you unlock your screen per minute is highly differentiated when you're drinking and not drinking. So just from that alone, the app can say, I think you're a little bit buzzed, do not drive. But it gets better. Now it asks, how much time are you spending on the screen? Well, this is in seconds. So when you are heavy drinking, you're spending a lot more time, okay? Here's 3 other indicators. Key press, okay? So the first figure here is how many seconds between key presses. When you're drunk, you get sloppy. It gets delayed, okay? This is deletions. How many mistakes do you have to correct because you're sloppy? And this is how many insertions, which are corrections. So if you just add up these 5 things, they can predict your blood alcohol level with about 90% accuracy just by knowing how often you open your phone, how many times you tap on it, how fast you tap on it, how many errors you make. There is not a drop of self-report here. This is all organic occurring paradata. Now I'll show you another one. This is from a colleague, David Wetter, who I work with in Utah, and he does smoking research. Well, they did a really smart thing. So want to help people who are relapsing not relapse. PuffMaker can do that. PuffMaker takes a device on your wrist that's basically an accelerometer and a band around your lungs, and it now can tell you what you're doing. While you are walking, this is your respiration and wrist pattern. Very different than when you're bringing the cigarette to your mouth, which is very different than when you're eating, despite the fact that respiration is the same. If you add to it the wrist motion, it is a very different. This is easy for them to discriminate. In fact, they were able to get 28 of 32 smoking relapses just from measuring these 2 pieces of data. Now you'll say no one's going to walk around with a Holter monitor on, right, or for the equivalent of. So they said, well, you know what, if I just had the wrist monitor, I'd still get 24 out of 32. So this is first generation stuff. Both of these are going to get better. But increasingly, we're not going to measure behavior directly. So what's next? I've already mentioned most of these. We're going to, I think, start to think about counseling that is not a tailored text. Right now, what we're doing is we're writing messages and trying to match them to the best of our ability to the person's psychological and behavioral status. In time, it will truly be AI. It will actually be asking, what is this person saying and what's my best response? I didn't talk a lot about this, but one of the most important things we will do is link it to electronic health records. So imagine if our app had everything inside your Epic or Cerner health record. If I knew your weight, if I knew your blood pressure, if I knew your A1C, if I knew your medication refills, we can just do an infinite world of things. People are doing that right now. It's actually a lot slower than you would think. Getting into health records has a lot of friction to it. We don't do a good job like Amazon and eBay do. We don't link people's purchases very well to health behavior. We should. There's some really good study that was published about 8 years ago that they predicted who was going to get HIV by the fact that they bought condoms at CVS. We can do that. All right. There are challenges in this research. Just one of the things that is very problematic is 95% of the apps have shitty message quality. When you look at how they're written, I mean this, my dad was an engineer, both my brothers are engineers. Engineers should not be writing health content. Sorry. But that's who's often writing them. They're so enamored with the tech that they forget that content matters. For researchers, it's hard. A 5-year cycle doesn't make sense for apps. The technology is obsolete. GPS is changing, and all these sensors are changing. So the way that NIH funds these things, even the SBR mechanism, is a little bit of a misfit. And if it takes you 2 years to get funded with, you have to put it in 2 or 3 times, you're already behind. So we need much more rapid response to get these things funded. Scientifically, one of the problems with NF is they're often part of a multi-component intervention, and we often make them as a supplemental thing, and because of that, you have to do fractional factorial designs to ask, is the mHealth thing in itself efficacious? Now, some of the things I've showed you would stand up on their own, but some of the things I showed you, for example, the gun safety thing in Flint, Michigan, they also get MI. The app is not on its own. because they need counseling, some of these young folks. So it's harder to determine, is it efficacious? I'm going to stop there so we have a chance for a few minutes. Hope whetted your appetite for what's coming down the line. Any questions or concerns?
We need you to use the mic. Yeah, we're taping it, so.
Oh, thank you. So I read Rise of the Robots. I don't know if anyone else did. It's a good book, good read. And they also predicted in 75 years, every job that exists today will be taken over by AI, and including counseling. My concern is, are there discussions around who is the owner of this technology? And then also, what is their responsibility to confidentiality, those owners?
Yeah, those are both things that are in flux. So the idea of RL or tailoring cannot be patented. That is sort of like patenting empathy. So there are parts of this that you can patent, but it's hard to do that. So a lot of the stuff is ultimately people can poach it, and which discourages the marketplace. So it might sound good, but it also could compress innovation. There are huge HIPAA issues with this stuff, and that's one of the reasons why the EHR linkage is so slow happening. There's very few apps out there that can pull an EHR, and right now it's only within a health system that, Aetna can do it or Kaiser can do it for their patients. But cross-platform is going to be a while before an app could say, I'm going to pull from Aetna and Blue Cross or something like that. So who owns it right now is complicated. Eventually, I think it will be clear that the patient owns it, at least what's inside of it. But I'm sure the developers will have consent forms that also give them access to analyze it. I mean, there's great big data. Just imagine you could do some amazing things if I knew what intervention sequence worked for whom. That is golden information. Yeah, but your concerns are there's a lot of gray areas ethically and stuff. Yeah.
What about liability issues?
Yeah, that has happened. We do have to have legal review our apps to make sure there's very low harm potential. And then the violence one, in theory, we could indirectly encourage a risk behavior or something. So yeah, there's very subtle ones. A little less so with the fast food one and the salt one, but with the violence one, I think we've had to think very seriously about making sure there's nothing in there that's encouraging.
Or failure to detect?
Yeah, that's interesting. Malpractice is not just incompetence, but negligence. So hopefully we're just incompetent. We're not negligent. But yeah, that's a great question, particularly as these things get deeper into personal health records and things get disclosed. If people don't close their phone, things like that, you could disclose a lot of information about your substance use and that you have a gun with you.
So you mentioned earlier, a lot of interventions are multifaceted, and I'm thinking particularly with the idea of the AI counselor, which definitely creeps me out personally. But how do you think, besides the general pros and cons, what about follow-up and referrals? So for instance, if someone is showing signs that they need psychiatric care after receiving counseling, how would the testament of a non-existent being follow? How could you implement that for psychiatric care, and again, follow-up referrals, getting them to other places? And how would you convince a real-life person, listen to this computer because this person needs help?
Yeah. So it goes back to her question a little bit too. So we in the violence app have a emergency button that if anyone scores really high on any of these things, I'm going to hurt someone right now. We don't notify the police, but I do believe eventually we might have to incorporate that. We already have, you could talk to a counselor now if you really need to. So I think even in these electronic environments, this telemedicine environment, we could still have, currently it will be a human, eventually it might be just a different AI agent, but for now, it's not hard for it to automatically put a big button on the screen, push here to talk to a counselor. Now you have to have 24-hour staffing, which is not that easy, so it's not going to be available in our study 24/7. We may only be able to call them back 12 hours later, which is not ideal. So you guys are raising really good questions. The question ultimately is, it's ultimately better for society and worse on balance, warts and all. It doesn't have to be perfectly positive to be useful, because that's how drugs are licensed. They're not saying, is it only a good drug? It's on balance, is it better for society or for this patient population? I think if we're held by that standard, we'll be better off than has it led to one extra death on the negative end, then we probably never get approved. But these are great questions.
So we're going to take one more question and real quick answer, but just for everybody, we are having a reception afterward, so we can have more questions for Ken, but there is a group of 30 students that are waiting to come in, so I hate to rush you all, but one more question, quick
We'll be
answer.
outside, yeah.
Hi. So I've been doing a little bit of tailoring work myself, but on a very small budget. That's very hard to do,
Yeah.
Especially building that message library. So I'm really excited to see that we're moving towards more sensing types of collecting data that would help, do the tailoring part of it. But still, a large part of deep tailoring relies on self-report. Am I right?
Yep.
So that can get pretty onerous on participants.
Yep.
What would be the ideal, especially for long-term behavioral interventions,
Yeah.
Ideal scheduling of self-report?
So obviously, if we could sense it by movement and by prior behavior and location and time of day, which we can with cigarettes and food, but what we have to think about is adaptive assessment. So that if I've measured your anger 14 days in a row and it hasn't moved once, the app should now adapt your measurement to less frequent. So just like we use reinforcement learning for the intervention, we should adaptively measure things so that I'm going to measure it the fewest times possible. The other thing is understanding item response theory and psychometrics. Let's find the items that best discriminate who needs this. And that can be done after your study is done. You can look at certain patterns of response, like which item on my 10 items is the best predictor. So it requires some pretty sophisticated, I think, psychometrics with a desire always to make things shorter. We're always going in that direction. No one wants to make them longer. And then trying to adaptively measure things. There's again, David Wetter is one of the best in the country. He has papers out on how many days in a row do you have to ask something around craving. And we're about to publish something. How many days do you have to ask about gun carriage? Do you have to ask it every day, every other day? And we have to really think about, just like we did with dietary assessment, for nutrients, you need 22 days of dietary recalls. And for certain things, you need 2. I think we need the same thing with other behaviors where we say how many times you have to measure it.
Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Resnick, and please join us for reception outside. And if you would exit on this side, I think the big group of 230 students is coming in the other side. So thank you very much. Sorry about that. We could have gone on all day. I think there's a lot of people that are interested. Yeah, it's just